During the company party, loud music mixed with laughter and conversations, creating a vibrant and intoxicating atmosphere. I was there, next to the woman I loved, holding a glass of wine while watching the people around. It was an ordinary night, another social event where forced smiles and formal conversations mixed with corporate politics. Everything seemed normal, until an out-of-place detail caught my attention. A strange man, dressed with exaggerated elegance, looked at my wife as if he had known her for years. There was something about him, an arrogant confidence, a cynical gleam in his eyes, as if he already knew something I didn't. My heart accelerated when I saw that she didn't look away, didn't move away, didn't show any discomfort. On the contrary. She smiled. I felt a chill run down my spine as he approached. With an overwhelming naturalness, he invaded our space as if he were part of our history, as if he had the right to be there, as if I were the intruder. My fingers closed around the glass, but my voice caught in my throat when I saw what happened next. Without hesitation, without fear, without guilt, he grabbed my wife by the waist, pulling her close to him. And then it happened. The kiss. It wasn't a forced kiss, it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an act of impulse. It was a kiss given, consented. A kiss that lasted long enough to destroy everything I knew about my life. My legs became weak. My chest seemed to deflate. The air became heavy and suffocating. I expected a reaction, a move away, a desperate look in my direction, a sign that it wasn't real. But what I saw was something that crushed me in ways I could never have imagined. She closed her eyes and surrendered to the moment. My wife, the woman I chose to share my life with, was not only kissed by another man, but kissed back as if I didn't exist. Anger came like a punch to the stomach, followed by a biting cold. The betrayal wasn't just in that kiss, it was in every detail. In the absence of guilt, in silent surrender, in evident pleasure. The party around us continued, laughter and music filling the space, but for me everything had gone silent. It was like I was in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. My mind refused to accept what my eyes saw. Every fraction of a second seemed to drag on, each beat of my heart weighed like lead inside my chest. I could feel the eyes around. Some people had noticed. Some had stopped their conversations and were now watching me, waiting to see what my reaction would be. But I couldn't react. Not there. Not in the middle of all this. My hands were shaking and my lips were dry. I knew that if I tried to speak, my voice would crack. If he tried to face that man, he would completely lose control. So I did the only thing my dazed mind could think of. I turned my back and left. The way home was a blur. The city lights passed by too quickly, and the sound of traffic sounded distant. My thoughts were in chaos, a storm of unanswered questions. How did this happen? How did I not see it? Who was he? Since when was this happening? With each hypothesis, with each possible answer, the pain grew, burning inside like poison. The lump in my throat wouldn't loosen. The bitter taste of humiliation was unbearable. I tried to remember every moment, every sign that I might have ignored. Had she not loved me for a long time? Was I just a blind idiot? My heart wanted to believe that this was a mistake, that there was a rational explanation. But my reason knew the truth. I had been betrayed. And not just in a hidden way, but there, in front of everyone, as if I were insignificant. But what really destroyed me wasn't the kiss. It wasn't the fact that another man touched my wife. What destroyed me was realizing that, at some point, she chose that. He chose to hide, he chose to lie, he chose to continue. If it had been a slip, an impulsive mistake, perhaps there would have been room for forgiveness. But that was a conscious act. An act of betrayal with planning, an act of contempt. I was no longer her man. I was no longer part of her world. The silence in my house was deafening. Every corner now seemed empty, cold. The place where I felt safe, where I built my life alongside her, now seemed like just a space full of memories that had been tarnished. My gaze wandered to the photos scattered around the room. Our wedding, our travels, the moments that seemed to mean everything. But now they were nothing more than scenarios for a lie. I took off my ring, feeling its weight lessen, but knowing the real weight was inside me. I could confront her. I could scream, demand explanations, ask why. But I didn't want words. Words were empty. Words were what she used to deceive me. What I wanted was the truth. I wanted to discover every detail, every lie she told me. And I would do that. I would find out everything. Who was that man? Since when did this happen? Every bit of the charade I called marriage. But most of all, I would get revenge. It wouldn't be a simple divorce. It wouldn't be a calm and resigned goodbye. It would be epic. I wouldn't allow her to get out of this unscathed. Not after what you did to me. But what I didn't know, what I still didn't imagine, was that the biggest shock was yet to come. What I would discover would change not just my view of her, but my entire life. Something much worse than just a kiss. Something that would make everything much more cruel. Something that would make the betrayal seem like just the beginning of a much darker truth. Welcome to the channel where betrayal will never be romanticized. Here, no infidelity is justified and every story is a brutal reminder of what disloyalty can do. Although they are fictional, each plot carries an undeniable truth: betrayal destroys lives, breaks bonds and leaves deep scars. So get ready. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reality check. Take a deep breath, because the truth hurts. Richard has always been a man of habit. His life followed a predictable, comfortable script, and he liked it. The work, the marriage, the spacious house in a quiet neighborhood, the evening dinners with Sophia, his wife, the lazy Sunday mornings where they drank coffee on the balcony while talking about anything without rushing. He liked the stability, the feeling of security that routine gave him. After years of building a solid career at a technology company and a relationship that, for all intents and purposes, seemed exemplary, he felt like he was in a place few reached. An accomplished man. It wasn't perfect, but nothing in life really was. However, Richard always believed that true love didn't need grandeur to be strong. It was in the small moments that he saw the value of what they built together. The way Sophia still looked at him sometimes, with that sparkle in her eyes as if she remembered the good times. The way their laughter filled the room when they watched a silly movie. The way she rested her head on his shoulder before sleeping, as if that was still the place where she felt safe. These details, for him, were proof that they were okay. That the marriage was still solid. That she still loved him. Perhaps not with the same passion as at the beginning, but in a deeper and calmer way, something he saw as a natural maturity. Sophia, in turn, was an elegant woman, full of life, always surrounded by friends and admired at work for her intelligence and charisma. He had an energy that enchanted everyone, a glow that seemed to light up any room. The way he gestured while he spoke, how he knew how to carry on a conversation and how he could make anyone feel special by his side. That's what attracted Richard from the beginning. She had a natural magnetism. Wherever he went, he attracted attention. But, contrary to what many thought, she was never the type of woman who was dazzled by that. At least, that's what he believed. Their marriage had always been based on complicity, and he liked to think that despite the differences between them, their respect and affection had never diminished. But lately, something felt different. Richard couldn't say exactly what it was. Small details, perhaps. As if there was something in her gaze that he couldn't quite decipher. Something that escaped. A hesitation in his kisses. A subtle, almost imperceptible distance, but one that, for someone like him, who had always prided himself on knowing his wife better than anyone else, was impossible not to notice. Still, he pushed those thoughts away whenever they arose. I didn't want to be the kind of paranoid husband who saw problems where none existed. I preferred to believe it was just routine, the natural wear and tear of the years. But inside, there was a restlessness that he couldn't completely quiet. I tried to compensate for this by being an even more present husband. He made surprises, romantic dinners, small demonstrations of affection. And for a while, he thought that was enough. That whatever that void was, that shadow hovering between them, would soon disappear. But sometimes, even when she smiled, something about him told her that that smile wasn't completely sincere. That there was something more there, something he couldn't reach. And it was this feeling, this uncertainty that dragged on silently, that began to weigh on him more and more. The company party was approaching and, as always, Sophia was excited. She loved social events and was always the type of person who shined in any environment. Richard, on the other hand, never really liked that kind of occasion. I found it tiring, a spectacle of falsehood and empty formalities. But he accompanied his wife because he knew how important it was to her. It was a balance they had learned to maintain over the years. She liked the shine and interaction, he preferred discretion. And in the end, it always worked. Or, at least, he believed it worked. On the night of the event, Sophia looked stunning. Elegant dress, impeccable makeup, the soft perfume he always loved. Richard watched her as she got ready, feeling the silent pride of having such an incredible woman by his side. But he also felt something else. Something I couldn't name. A vague premonition, an uneasiness that he quickly ignored. When they arrived at the party, everything seemed normal. Sophia walked around the room naturally, greeting acquaintances, laughing, enjoying the evening. Richard followed, keeping a low profile as he always did. But then, something changed. He noticed a look. A look that shouldn't be there. A look that lasted too long. A look exchanged between his wife and a man he didn't know. Richard couldn't say why it bothered him so much. Maybe because she didn't dodge immediately. Maybe because, for a moment, it seemed like there were only the two of them there. 1 second. 2. 3. Enough to make your stomach turn. The man was tall, well-dressed, and had a very confident manner. As if he knew exactly what he was doing. As if he had already conquered that woman before. He shouldn't be there. Not like that. Not with that look. Richard felt a pang of discomfort. He forced himself to ignore it. Maybe it was an exaggeration. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was seeing things where there was nothing. But then the man approached. And nothing about Sophia indicated surprise. She just smiled. And it was at that moment that Richard felt, for the first time, the bitter taste of doubt turning into certainty. Richard tried to ignore that uncomfortable feeling settling in his chest, that dark foreboding that seemed to linger like an invisible specter since the night of the party. But it was impossible. Since then, something inside him wouldn't leave him alone. He tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, that it was all just a wrong impression, but his mind refused to accept it. He saw Sophia's face every morning, studied her gestures, her looks, her carefully chosen words. And for the first time in years, he felt like there was something about her that wasn't his anymore. It was a subtle but present detail. Small pauses in the middle of conversations, a sudden distraction when he looked her in the eyes, the way her cell phone always seemed to be face down on the table. Small things, but together, they formed a truth that he still didn't want to see. He tried to push these thoughts away, he tried to occupy his mind with work, with routine, with anything that would prevent him from getting lost in this spiral of uncertainty. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more these doubts gained strength. He found himself watching her movements without realizing it, paying attention to every detail. The scent that seemed different on certain days. The time she spent in the bath was longer than usual. The unexpected outings, the last-minute dinners with her friends, the moments when she laughed alone looking at her cell phone before quickly putting the device away when she saw him approaching. He wanted to trust, he wanted to tell himself that it was all just paranoia, but something inside him screamed that it wasn't. The idea of being cheated on was something he had never considered before. Not Sophie. Not the woman who was always his companion, his confidant, the person who shared his dreams, his joys, his failures. But reality began to weigh heavily on him. Suspicion became a need for certainty. He needed to know. I couldn't continue living in doubt. He decided that he would wait for a moment to act, a mistake, an opportunity that would allow him to see the truth. He didn't have to wait long. That night, Sophia said she was going out to dinner with her friends. He said it as naturally as always, with a practiced smile and a quick kiss before heading out the door. But something about the way she avoided his gaze bothered him. He waited a few minutes, long enough for her to walk away, and then grabbed his car keys and followed her. His heart hammered in his chest, a mix of fear and anger mixing in his mind. He drove cautiously, keeping enough distance so she wouldn't notice. As her car parked in front of a fancy restaurant, he wondered if he really wanted to see what he was about to see. If he was ready to face what he feared. But it was already too late to retreat. He saw her get out of the car, adjusting her dress, looking around as if to make sure no one was watching her. Then, he appeared. The same man from the party. Tall, confident, with a satisfied smile on his face. Richard felt his blood boil as he saw him approach Sophia intimately, his hands sliding gently around her waist. And she didn't back down. He didn't hesitate. It didn't seem uncomfortable. On the contrary. The smile she gave him was a smile Richard hadn't seen in a long time. A smile that was no longer his. He wanted to believe that maybe they were just friends, that there was nothing more to it than that. But the truth came like a punch to the stomach in the next instant. Because it was fast. Natural. As if there was no guilt, as if it had happened before. The man held Sophia's face in his hands and kissed her. And she kissed him back. No resistance. No hesitation. With delivery. As if Richard didn't exist. As if he had never existed. It was at that moment that everything inside him broke. There was no longer any doubt. It was no longer paranoia. It was real. It was the truth he never wanted to face, but now it hit him like a sharp blade. Sophia didn't just cheat on him. She chose that. He chose that man. He chose to live something hidden, something that Richard was not part of. And what destroyed him most was realizing that she showed no regret. That kiss wasn't a mistake. It was a wish. A desire she never felt for him again. The air around him felt heavy. His hands shook on the steering wheel. He wanted to act. He wanted to confront them there, he wanted to see her reaction when she realized he knew. But he couldn't move. His body was frozen. All he could do was watch as his wife, the woman he built a life with, the woman he swore was his, gave herself to another man as if he had never existed. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching his own life fall apart. By the time he realized it, he was gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers were numb. So, without thinking, he started the car and drove away. He drove aimlessly, not knowing where to go. I just wanted to get away from it. He wanted to erase that image from his mind, he wanted to not feel that suffocating pain in his chest. But no matter how hard he tried, their kiss kept replaying in his head like a curse. When he got home, the house that now seemed empty and cold, he didn't know what to do. He sat on the couch, staring into space, trying to process what had happened. Anger began to build within him. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was humiliation. The fact that he was deceived. That he trusted her. That while he was making plans for the future, she was in the arms of another man. He wanted revenge. He wanted her to feel the pain he was feeling. But most of all, I wanted answers. I wanted to understand how she was able to do that to him. Hours later, Sophia arrived home. He entered smiling, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't spent the night in another man's arms. Richard watched her from the armchair where he was sitting, studying every detail of her expression. The smell of the perfume that wasn't his was still on his skin. The glow in her eyes still carried the traces of another presence. She approached him, kissed him on the forehead, as she did every night, and asked him how his day was. He felt his stomach drop. Hatred burning inside him. But he forced himself to smile. He forced himself to pretend that nothing had changed. Because before he exploded, before he threw everything in her face, he needed something more. He needed the truth. He needed to know who that man was. Since when did that happen? What were the lies she told? And, above all, I needed to understand. He needed to understand why, after everything they had experienced, after everything he gave her, she chose to destroy everything. And, without knowing it, Sophia has just signed her own ruin. Because Richard wouldn't rest until he figured out every detail. Every lie. Every secret. And what he was about to discover. This was far worse than he could have ever imagined. Richard felt the weight of the silence as he stared at Sophia across the room. The woman he thought he knew was there, serene, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. He had spent the last few days putting the pieces together, observing every detail, piecing together the fragments of the truth that was slowly unfolding before his eyes. The betrayal was a cruel blow, but something inside him said he still didn't know everything. And it was this doubt, this hole that seemed to open beneath his feet, that made him go further. He needed to know who that man was, why Sophia chose him and, above all, how far her lies went. The investigation started subtly. He scrolled through messages when she was distracted, checked the times she said she was busy, revisited every detail of the last few weeks with a critical eye. The lover's name, Daniel, appeared in a log of frequent calls. But it wasn't just that. The more Richard looked, the more he realized that Daniel was not a stranger. He was not a chance in Sophia's life. It wasn't someone who simply crossed your path. Daniel has been there before. He was already part of their story. The revelation came as a shock. Richard found an old photo, stored among old boxes in the closet. A wedding portrait, him and Sophia smiling, surrounded by friends. And there, in the background, Daniel. The same man. Except he wasn't a stranger. He was at their wedding. He was part of that night. It was a face that was present when it all began. A detail that went unnoticed for years. But why? Why was he there? Why is he back now? Richard began to pull at the loose thread of memory. Reviewing conversations, old interactions, names mentioned by Sophia over the years. Daniel wasn't just a distant guest. He was someone who was once close. And when Richard finally connected the dots, the blood ran cold in his veins. Daniel was an old love. Not just an ex, but Sophia's first love. The one she never forgot. The one who has somehow remained in his shadow all these years. The truth was worse than he imagined. Sophia never completely chose him. Never loved him as he believed. Daniel was always there, like a ghost among them, like an untouchable memory that never disappeared. And now, he was back, claiming what had always been his. The ground seemed to slip away from beneath Richard's feet as he realized what this meant. His marriage was a lie. He was never Sophia's first choice. It was always the alternative, the security, the plan B. He never had her heart completely. And now, the truth cruelly presented itself before him. That night, he could no longer contain his anger. Sophia arrived home and found Richard waiting for her. His look was different. There was no shouting, no impulsive accusations. There was something much worse. There was a dark calm, a painful certainty. She stopped at the door, hesitant, feeling like something was about to explode. He watched her for a moment, as if seeing her for the first time. Then he handed the photo to her. She took it, confused, and the instant her eyes found Daniel in the image, her expression changed. It wasn't a surprise. It was something deeper. It was guilt. Richard waited. He let the weight of that photograph speak for itself. Sophia opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Her eyes filled with uncertainty, as if she was searching for a way to justify, to deny. But there was no justification. There was no way to erase the truth. He finally broke the silence, and his voice was cold, calculated. He asked how long it had been. She asked if Daniel was just a fluke or if he had always been in her thoughts. He asked if he, Richard, ever really meant anything. Sophia hesitated. She tried to hold his hand, but he backed away. He tried to come up with an answer, but nothing seemed enough. Then the confession came. Bent down, hesitant, as if the words burned her. She said that Daniel was her first love, that she never completely forgot him, that there were moments over the years when she wondered what it would have been like if she had chosen differently. He admitted that he never had the courage to say it, that he preferred to pretend that he was fine, that he could be happy with Richard. But deep down, a part of her always belonged to Daniel. He felt the air escape his lungs. Everything around seemed to lose meaning. Their marriage, their history together, the moments he thought were real. It was all an illusion. He wasn't the love of Sophia's life. It never was. He was just a substitute. And the worst? She knew this all along. Anger mixed with pain as he tried to process what he had heard. It wasn't just a betrayal of the body. It was something much worse. It was a betrayal of the soul. She deceived him from the beginning. She let him believe that they were happy, that they had something real. But all they had was make-believe. Sophia was crying now, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. He said he never wanted to hurt him, that he never planned for things to get to this point. That I didn't know how to explain what I felt. But Richard didn't want any more explanations. I didn't want any more words. He already had all the answers he needed. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of decision settle in his chest. He wouldn't stay there another second. I couldn't live in that lie any longer. He looked at Sophia one last time, and this time there was no love, there was no pleading, there was no hope. Just a deep void. He left without looking back. Because now, he finally understood. He never lost Sophia to Daniel. Because, in fact, he never had it. Richard walked out of the house without looking back, the cold night air hitting his face as his footsteps echoed heavily in the silence. His thoughts were in turmoil, a chaos of anger and frustration that threatened to swallow him whole. The world he knew, the life he built, now seemed like a grotesque lie. The image of Sophia hesitating, trying to justify what was unjustifiable, still pulsed through his mind like poison. He didn't want to listen anymore. I didn't want to think anymore. I just wanted to disappear. He drove through unfamiliar streets, without a destination. The city that had always felt familiar now seemed strange, oppressive. Every red light felt like an invitation for him to just close his eyes and leave it all behind. But he didn't do that. Instead, he continued driving until, without realizing it, he found himself parked in front of a small, discreet bar, with yellow lights flickering on the sidewalk. He walked in without thinking, sat at the counter and ordered a dose of whatever could numb his mind. The alcohol burned down his throat, but not enough to erase the pain. The bar was almost empty, a few people scattered around tables, each immersed in their own miseries. Richard realized he wasn't the only one carrying a burden that night. The bartender gave him a brief look, assessing his condition, but didn't ask any questions. He only poured one more dose, and then another. It was then that a soft voice interrupted his reverie. "Looks like someone had a bad day." He looked up to find a woman sitting a few seats to his left, holding a glass of wine. She watched him with discreet interest, without the intention of invading his space, but with genuine curiosity. Something like that, he murmured, turning the glass between his fingers. She studied him for a moment, then smiled understandingly. You don't need to tell me what happened, but I can imagine it. I've seen that look before. From someone who lost something they thought was forever. Richard let out a short, bitter laugh. I think I lost something that was never mine. She raised her eyebrow, interested. This is worse. He was silent, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. I didn't want to talk about Sophia. He didn't want to give voice to the pain that still pulsed in his chest. But somehow, being there, next to a stranger, felt safer than being alone. She didn't press. He just took a sip of his wine and looked away, giving him space to decide if he wanted to continue the conversation. And you? He asked, after a while. What are you here running away from? She smiled sideways, playing with the rim of the glass. You're welcome. Or maybe everything. I think we all have something we want to escape from. Richard nodded. The silence between the two wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was a kind of silent truce. His cell phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Sophie. Probably sending messages, trying to explain, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. He ignored it. He asked for another dose. The woman next to him observed the gesture, but did not comment. He just smiled almost sadly. It doesn't matter what happened, she said softly. You won't find the answer at the bottom of that glass. He let out a tired sigh. I know. But for today, I prefer to pretend so. She didn't insist. He just silently toasted him before finishing his wine and disappearing into the night, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. Hours later, when he finally returned home, he found Sophia sitting in the living room, her eyes red, her face marked by anguish. But he felt nothing but emptiness. He passed her without saying a word, ignoring her call. He didn't want arguments. I didn't want an apology. I just wish it didn't exist there. But she got up, moved by despair, grabbed his arm and begged him to talk to her. You can't just ignore me, Richard. He turned slowly, his eyes carrying the full weight of the night. Yes, I can. She swallowed hard. You need to listen to me. He laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. I needed a lot of things, Sophia. But apparently it wasn't enough. She shivered, but didn't let go of his arm. I was wrong, I know, but I never wanted to hurt you. Anger rose like a suffocating wave. But it hurt. It hurt because you lied all these years. It hurt because while I thought we were happy, you were wondering what it would have been like if you were with him. It hurt because, in the end, I was never his first choice. Her eyes filled with tears. That's not true. And yes. You just don't want to admit it. She sobbed, bringing her hands to her face. Richard. I swear, I never planned this. He watched her for a moment, studying every feature of her expression, trying to find a spark of truth. But he already knew. I wanted to believe in you so much. But now, I just want it to be over. She looked at him, desperate. What are you talking about? He pulled the keys out of his pocket, holding them between his fingers. From our wedding. Shock was on her face. No, please, Richard. He sighed, exhausted. I'm not a consolation prize, Sophia. It never should have been. She tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away. Can't we fix this? He stared at her for a long time. No. She collapsed on the couch, crying. But he no longer felt anything. Just bitter relief. That night, he slept in the guest room, and the next day, he left early. His lawyer already had the divorce papers prepared. He didn't want fights. I didn't want revenge. He just wanted his freedom back. Sophia called countless times. He sent messages, tried to see him, begged for a chance. But he had already made his decision. 2 weeks later, he left the house he once called home, taking only the essentials. And as he drove away, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Richard drove aimlessly, feeling the weight of the past dissolving with each kilometer he left behind. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't need to see what was no longer part of him. The decision had been made, and for the first time in a long time, he felt in control. The end of marriage was not just the end of a relationship, but the end of an illusion. For years, he believed that love meant security, that all he had to do was be a good man, faithful, dedicated, for it to be enough. But now he knew the truth. Some people never stop carrying the shadows of the past with them, and Sophia was one of those people. He hasn't lost her to Daniel now. He had lost her a long time ago, perhaps before he even had her. The temporary apartment he decided to stay in was small, simple, with nothing that reminded him of the life he had before. And that was exactly what I wanted. The silence in the place was different from that of the house where he lived with Sophia. It was not a silence full of lies and secrets, but a clean, almost welcoming silence. He spent the first few days in a strange state, oscillating between the pain of betrayal and the relief of being free of it. The phone rang tirelessly, messages piled up unread. Sophia insisted, trying to hold on to the pieces of a marriage she herself destroyed. But he wouldn't answer. No more. Time passed, and he realized there was something strange about his new freedom. He expected to feel destroyed, torn apart, but instead he felt light. Not that the pain didn't exist, of course it did, but it no longer consumed him. It was a different void, one that didn't beg to be filled with false promises. Still, something worried him. She couldn't get the image of Daniel out of her head, the man who had been in her shadow all these years. Richard knew he couldn't move forward without confronting everything that happened. It wasn't enough to just leave the past behind. He needed to face it. That's why, one night, after thinking and rethinking, she decided to find him. Not to fight, not to revenge, but to understand. If Sophia spent so many years living with that man's shadow in her heart, then he needed to see for himself what was there that was able to keep that feeling alive for so long. Didn't warn. He just showed up at the restaurant where he knew he would be. She felt a chill run down her spine when she entered and saw him sitting at the table, calm, as if nothing had happened. The anger came, quickly, but Richard held it back. She sat in front of him, without looking away. Daniel looked up, surprised at first, but then he smirked. I confess I didn't expect that. Richard took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. I didn't expect to need to be here either. The other man leaned forward a little, resting his elbows on the table. And what exactly do you want? Richard didn't respond right away. He studied the face in front of him, trying to see what Sophia saw there. I want to understand. I want to know why, after so many years, you were still there. I want to know if I ever had a real chance, or if everything I lived was a lie. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. The truth? I didn't expect it to happen like this. But I think deep down I always knew that Sophia never forgot me. Richard clenched his fists, but controlled himself. And you just showed up to claim what was yours? The man smiled, a tired smile. It wasn't like that. I never went after her. I never tried to ruin your marriage. But when we met again by chance, everything came back. And you know you can't fight what's always been there. Richard shook his head in disbelief. So you think all this was inevitable? Daniel was silent for a moment, then responded with brutal honesty. I think some stories never really end. The anger returned with force, but with it, something else. A weight being lifted from your shoulders. For the first time, he realized it wasn't his fault. No matter what he did, no matter how good a husband he was, Sophia was never completely by his side. There was always something between them, something he could never change. He didn't lose. There was never a game to win. He stood up, feeling a strange relief course through his body. So I hope you are happy now. Because I'm ready to move on. Daniel just nodded, and Richard left the restaurant without looking back. In the days that followed, Richard began to rebuild his life. Found a new routine, new habits. He stopped thinking about Sophia with pain. He began to see her only as someone who went through his story, but who would not remain in it. He realized that, for the first time in years, he was free to discover himself again. And that's when he met someone. I wasn't expecting it, I wasn't looking for it, but life has strange ways of surprising us. A casual meeting, a light conversation that turned into another and then another. A woman who carried no shadows of the past, who made no comparisons, who only existed in the present with him. It was different. And Richard realized that this was what he needed. Not a great love that competed with memories, but someone who was there, whole, just like he was now. Sophia still tried. He sent one last message saying that he missed you, that he wanted to talk. But he didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. She made her choice. And he did his. The past would stay where it should be. He had a new path ahead of him. And this time, he would choose himself. Richard didn't look back. The past no longer haunted him as before, and Sophia's presence was now just a distant echo, a memory that no longer had power over him. The days passed and he found himself immersed in his new life, in a new routine where the weight of betrayal no longer weighed so much on his shoulders. The temporary apartment that had previously seemed like an improvised refuge now began to take on the appearance of a home. He began to allow himself small joys, like a coffee in the morning without the rush of before, choosing a new restaurant without the need to consult anyone, the simple pleasure of being alone without it feeling like a burden. But the absolute silence of the nights still made him reflect. Not everything inside him was completely healed. There was still something there, remnants of pain and disappointment that appeared at the most unexpected moments. It was during one of these nights that, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sit on the balcony of his apartment and just breathe. He looked at the city in front of him, the lights flashing in a chaotic rhythm, and he wondered if Sophia also looked at the same view, if she thought about him, if she regretted it. He knew that, somehow, she was still waiting for an answer, a chance to explain herself. But what more could be said? What could he hear that would change something? And then, as if fate had decided to test his strength, the phone rang. He didn't need to look to know who it was. He stood still, staring at the device, feeling the weight of the decision he would need to make. Answering would mean opening a door he had closed. Leaving her unanswered would mean ending everything once and for all. But he answered. The silence on the other side was long. He could hear Sophia's shaky breathing, as if she was gathering the courage to speak. I know I shouldn't be calling. He didn't respond right away. He let her feel the weight of that connection, of what it meant to be there, breaking the silence he fought to build. Then why are you? She hesitated. Because I needed it. Because I don't know how to move forward without talking to you. Richard ran a hand over his face, feeling exhaustion taking over. You've already moved on, Sophia. You just don't want to admit it. It's not true. I didn't follow. I'm lost. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of her words hang between them. You lost me. I'm not part of your life anymore. The sound of her crying came muffled, as if she was trying to hold back her tears. I know, but I wish things had been different. Richard let out a bitter laugh. You wish I had been blind. That I had never discovered. No. I wish the love we had been enough. Those words hit him in an unexpected way. Because, deep down, he wanted that too. I also wished that the love I felt for her had been enough to stop everything that happened. But it wasn't. But it wasn't, Sophia. It wasn't enough for you. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. I hate myself for what I did to you. He shook his head, even though he knew she couldn't see him. It is not necessary. I already hated myself enough for both of us. The line went silent again. He waited for her to say something more, to try to convince him that there was still something to be saved. But this time, Sophia just sighed. I just wanted you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. Richard was silent for a moment. But it hurt. And then he hung up. The weight of that conversation stayed with him for the rest of the night, but, contrary to what he expected, he didn't feel angry. Just a deep tiredness, a feeling that this was the last piece he was missing so he could actually move forward. Over the next few days, he focused even more on himself, allowing himself things that had previously seemed small but now had greater meaning. He started running in the morning, found a new cafe where he liked to spend time, immersed himself in work without it being an escape. And then, something unexpected happened. She was there, in the same cafe he now frequented. Sitting alone, with a book in her hands, without realizing that he was watching her. Fate seemed to play with him again, but this time, in a different way. He hesitated before approaching, but something inside him urged him to go. Is this book good? The woman looked up, surprised by the sudden contact. Then he smiled, closing the book gently. Depends on what you consider good. He smiled back, sitting in the chair across from her without asking permission. After what I've been through in the last few months, I think anything that doesn't involve cheating is a good start. She raised her eyebrow, amused but not asking questions. So you're looking for stories with happy endings? Richard was silent for a moment, thinking about it. I think I still don't know what I'm looking for. She nodded, as if she understood. Then maybe this book is exactly what you need. He watched her for a moment. There was something about her that wasn't like Sophia. Something that didn't make him feel like he needed to prove himself, that didn't make him question whether he was being enough. She just existed there, in the present, without the shadows of the past hanging over her. And he realized that this was what he needed. They spent the afternoon talking, without rushing, without the need to cover up scars. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The past could continue to exist, but it no longer had power over him. And this time, he was ready to move on. The months passed in a blur, but with each day that Richard left behind, he felt further away from the man he once was. The pain of betrayal hadn't completely disappeared, but now it was just a shadow in the back of my mind, something that no longer weighed so much. He learned to accept that some stories just aren't meant to last, no matter how right they seem at first. Sophia was not a mistake, but she was also never the final destination. He understood that some people come into our lives just to teach us lessons that, at the moment, we don't want to learn. But eventually, learning takes place. And now, Richard no longer saw the past as a prison. He looked ahead. For what was yet to come. The new routine brought small joys that previously seemed insignificant. The mornings were peaceful, without the weight of someone's presence that made him feel like he needed to be more than he was. Work was going well, morning runs became a habit and, unexpectedly, he found comfort in the company of that woman he met at the cafe. He didn't see her as a replacement, and maybe that's why the connection between them was so different. There was no rush, there were no unrealistic expectations. Just two strangers allowing themselves to experience the present without the constraints of the past. Sophia, on the other hand, did not suffer the same fate. After Richard cut her out of his life, she tried to move on, but something inside her always went back to that moment when he left her. She believed she would feel relief at finally being with Daniel, but the truth was very different. What seemed like an unbreakable love in memory turned out to be a fragile illusion when put to the test in the present. Daniel was no longer the man she loved when she was young, and she was no longer the same woman he once knew. The memories that seemed so perfect were just that, memories. When they found themselves free to live what had previously been interrupted, the enchantment quickly disappeared. Time revealed irreparable cracks. Daniel was possessive, and Sophia, for the first time, felt what it was like to be on the other side of the story. He didn't trust her completely, perhaps because he knew what she was capable of. The fight started early, impatience replaced passion, and in a short time, what should have been the great love of his life became a weight. One day, without warning, he just left. There were no goodbyes, there were no broken promises. Just an empty house and a piercing absence. Sophia was left behind, just like she left Richard. Fate was in no hurry, but took its toll at the right time. She tried to look for him, tried to repair what was already broken, but Daniel wasn't Richard. He didn't give second chances. She found herself alone, feeling the consequences of her choices. The marriage she threw away for an illusion was now a ghost that tormented her. She tried to contact Richard more than once, but he never responded. He was no longer her safe haven. She had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, Richard took the opposite path. For the first time, he allowed himself to live without the need to carry someone else's burden. He rediscovered the pleasure of owning his own story, of making choices that were exclusively his. The woman he met at the cafe became an increasingly constant presence, but without pressure, without comparisons. Just two people walking side by side, without needing eternal promises to justify the connection between them. The divorce was finalized without major confrontations. Sophia signed the papers silently, without asking for anything else. For the first time, she understood that there was no way back. What once was love was now just a distant memory. The emptiness she felt when she saw him leave was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Because deep down, she knew. I would never have someone like him again. And then, one day, Richard realized that he no longer thought about her in pain. I no longer woke up feeling the weight of the past. The man who once suffered from betrayal was now a free man. He looked at the horizon and realized that, for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And so, everyone went their own way. Sophia, trapped in the consequences of her choices. Richard, discovering a new beginning. The past no longer had power over him. Because the true beginning happens when we understand that some losses are not curses, but rather liberations. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment below your opinion and tell me what impacted you most. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe and not miss any stories like this. And remember, betrayal will never be justified. It destroys lives, breaks bonds and leaves scars that cannot always be erased. Here, we do not romanticize disloyalty. Thanks for watching this far and see you in the next story.